This is the Macuahuitl, one of the most legendary weapons of all time, a sword with an edge of obsidian, the sharpest material on Earth. The Aztecs used these devastating weapons to build the most powerful empire of the continent. When the Spanish conquistadors first encountered the Macuahuitl, they were horrified. Eyewitness accounts insist it could decapitate a horse in a single swing. Today, we're going to uncover the truth behind that deadly reputation. We'll dive into its origins and recreate several authentic Macuahuitl. We will put them to the ultimate test against meat, armor, and even steel weaponry to see what this obsidian sword was truly capable of. The Macuahuitl came known to the pages of history when the Spanish first entered the Americas. I think everyone is fascinated by this period. Unlike many gradual changes in history, the Spanish conquest of the Americas happened quickly in brutal fashion, with steel-bearing Spanish fighting against obsidian-armed Mexica. It was truly a clash of worlds, struggling for the future of the lands. And for the indigenous peoples of Mexico, that future came with devastating loss. Their way of life was shattered, and countless traditions and knowledge have faded away. Yet the Macuahuitl endured as a symbol of indigenous identity and warrior spirit. But here's the problem. Most people today have no idea what a real Macuahuitl actually looked like. The cheap replicas you've seen online with the blocky obsidian squares aren't even close to the weapons that shaped the fate of empires. And if we're going to understand how this weapon could slice through horses, armor, and men, we need to start with how a real Macuahuitl was made. Instead of square blocks, true Macuahuitl used long, razor-like obsidian blades that formed a continuous cutting edge, sharper than the finest steel. But to understand why, we need a quick lesson in flintknapping. When you strike a piece of flint or obsidian, they break in a smooth wave-like pattern known as a conchoidal fracture. This edge is significantly sharper than the finest steel blades. When viewed under a microscope, steel blades have a jagged, irregular edge, while obsidian remains smooth. This creates a molecularly thin edge radius that can be only about 10 atoms thick, while the sharpest steel blades are around 500 atoms thick. Meaning obsidian blades can be 50 times sharper than the sharpest steel blades. But not all obsidian tools are created equal. Most of the tools you see online are the product of bifacial knapping, the process of flaking both sides of a core to create a bifacial cutting tool. But these tools have jagged edges. They are great for cutting meat, but they are not the sharpest blades in the world. Regular obsidian flakes are actually much sharper, but they are often irregularly shaped. Ancient humans learned how to shape stone cores into cylindrical prisms so that they could take off long and even blades. These blades have a conchoidal fracture running down their entire length, providing an excellent cutting edge. This is what the blade of the Macuahuitl is made out of. The Aztecs and other Mesoamerican cultures lived in one of the most obsidian-rich places on Earth, leading to them becoming one of the best flintknapping cultures of all time. Their blades were so sophisticated that master flintknappers struggle to replicate them to this day. I have flintknapped for years, and I wouldn't even attempt to make Aztec prismatic blades as I know I will fail miserably. But luckily, I know Tony Soares, a true master.
Razor sharp.
I had him knap these blades and send me the cores they came off of. They are truly works of art. With this understanding, you can see why 99% of Macuahuitl you see online are complete pieces of junk. People lack the knowledge, skill, or effort in order to make an accurate replica. But not on Northo 2. My growing suspicion of my own autism forces me to absolute historical accuracy. So next, let's look at authentic examples of Macuahuitl that have survived. For a long time, it was thought that the last Macuahuitl was destroyed in a fire at the Madrid Armory. Here, this absolutely stunning Macuahuitl was housed alongside the last Tepoztli, a bladed spear-like weapon used by the Aztecs. Both of them were highly decorated with very fine obsidian blades in their edges. The curators actually thought these were Japanese weapons, hence the pictures with samurai armor. But these examples were eventually destroyed in a fire, and it was really sad knowing that they were lost. That is, until an authentic example was found in Mexico City. Known as the San Marcos Street specimen, it was much simpler in design, likely representing the average Macuahuitl used in battle. It was a little over a meter or 3.5 feet long and had a much different form than the Madrid specimen. So these are the only two surviving examples that are known publicly in the modern day. Apparently, there are almost certainly more in storage in Mexican museums or in the hands of private collectors, though as of now this is all we have. But we do know a lot more about these weapons from Spanish accounts, but also the Florentine Codex. one of the most legendary documents of all time. It consisted of 2,500 pages with 200 illustrations drawn by native artists. Notably, it featured many images of the Macuahuitl. Many resembled the San Marcos street specimen, suggesting they were indeed a common variety. They are often depicted as painted blue, which I find just fascinating. I will be recreating a few different varieties of Macuahuitl. First, I will recreate the San Marcos street example. I used a board of white oak which I shaped with modern tools. This would have taken forever with the mostly stone tools of the Aztecs. Like I said, I got the obsidian blades made for me by a true master, and just look at them, they are absolutely stunning. But in order to be used, I have to trim both sides of them. This puts it into a more regular shape which can be fit in the edge of the Macuahuitl. To have them, I used an extremely strong glue made of pine sap, charcoal, wax, and cordage. This might not be identical to the glue used by the Aztecs, but it's more or less the same thing. The glue not only locks the blades into place, but also makes an even transition from blade to wood. This creates much less friction when the blade encounters flesh. This is completely different from the horrible ones you see on the internet. I even created an example of a poorly made Macuahuitl just to show you how bad they really are. Watch as ballistics gel encounters the obsidian square before running into the wood. This is no sword, it's a spiky club. Now watch as the ballistics gel encounters a real Macuahuitl. Now this will kill. The finished product is a true beauty to handle. Holding it against the sun lets you appreciate that you are holding a saber made of volcanic glass. A truly legendary weapon that emptied the arteries of many men. This recreation resembles probably the most average Macuahuitl, but I also want to make some other varieties. From direct accounts, we know they varied in size dramatically. Longer two-handed varieties described as being as tall as a man were recorded. I created a version of one of these also using white oak. Such a long handle will allow me to get some serious power into a swing, and I am thrilled to try it out. On the opposite side of the spectrum was the Macuahuitl, a smaller, more maneuverable version that was about 20 inches long with much fewer blades. It would have possibly been used as a sidearm or a self-defense weapon. And if we get to 100,000 likes on this video, I'll be giving away this weapon to one of you. In the other video I set a goal of like 10k likes and we hit that in 3 days, so hey, I might as well shoot for the moon. The Aztecs also used other obsidian bladed weapons, notably the spear-like Decapitation. I couldn't help myself, so I just had to make one of these too. This weapon is honestly just as cool as the Macuahuitl. Holding it against the sun is really just the coolest thing in the world. A spear made of volcanic glass. These weapons are truly beautiful and probably some of the coolest things I've ever made. Before we put these weapons to the test, let's quickly hear from a Spanish account about just how deadly they were. Conquistador Francisco de Aguilar wrote, "They used cudgels and swords and a great many bows and arrows. One Indian at a single stroke cut open the whole neck of Cristobal de Olid's horse, killing the horse. The Indian on the other side slashed at the second horseman and the blow cut through the horse's pastern, whereupon this horse also fell dead. Here many Spaniards fell, some dead and some wounded, and others without injury who fainted away from fright." This account really highlights just how effective these weapons were at lacerating flesh. In 2 separate cases, one cut from the Macuahuitl was enough to kill a horse. In another account, a horse was completely decapitated with one slice, but we will get into that later. Now it's finally time to put this weapon to the test.
We're going to be testing the Macuahuitl in this bone-in pork loin right here. It's got fat, it's got muscle, it's got bones, it's got everything. So we're going to see if these weapons were truly as deadly as the Spanish said they were. I literally just cut myself while filming that little intro, so yeah, this weapon is definitely super sharp. I also spent hundreds of dollars to buy this real rapier so we can compare it to the Macuahuitl. This is pretty similar to what the Spanish actually carried with them as they fought the Mexica in Mexico. And if you haven't guessed yet, this video was pretty expensive to put together, so please leave a like. Alright, I put the chainmail on because, you know, safety third. Let's take a swing at this thing, man. I'm gonna aim right here and just see what happens. Oh my goodness! That was absolutely devastating. We cut through it with such ease that I literally hit the backdrop because I was swinging so fast after cutting through it. And look at that wound. We cut right through the bone, all the way through all that meat. It didn't even stand a chance. And keep in mind, this isn't even a very big Macuahuitl. This is like a pretty average sized one. So imagine what the two-handed one could do to a piece of meat, a horse, or a human. And we do have some damage on the edge, but this could have been from hitting that backdrop. I'm not entirely sure. I'll have to watch the video back. But it's safe to say that the Macuahuitl has exceeded my expectations in every way. All right, next we're gonna be cutting it at a slant, so hopefully we hit some bone and see just how obsidian holds up when hitting bone. Oh. Well, again, that was absolutely devastating, but this time it seems we caught a lot more bone. It seems that backbone was just too tough for the blade of the Macuahuitl. We lost quite a few blades in that swing. But if we look at the blades, some of them are completely undamaged. Like this, the edge on this one is completely fine, so it seems that they just fell out of the glue. Let's do one more test before we test out the rapier. Oh my God. Well, I learned that the Macuahuitl really doesn't like bone. It did do a ton of damage to that vertebrae, but it did explode the blades in the process. Still, that's an absolutely gruesome wound. Now, we're going to be testing out the rapier. I have to admit that I have no experience with swords, so this is going to be very amateurish, but let's see what we can do. So the rapier is primarily a thrusting weapon, and though I have no experience with swords, I have done quite a bit of kickboxing, so I do understand how to throw a punch, and maybe that's a similar movement. I don't know. Anyone who's really into swords can comment down below. But let's see. Let's just do a few stabs first, and then we're going to do slices after. So I'm just going to throw it like a jab, pretty much. Oh, I missed. All right, now we're gonna put it to my rear hand, which would be my 2 if I was fighting, you know? So let's see if I can get a little more power into that. Oh. Wow, we just went right through that. That had some serious power. That would have been a dead Aztec warrior, I think. All right, let's hit it with another one of those really devastating thrusts. Well, in that example, I encountered bone with the thrust, but it didn't matter. It just bounced off and went right through anyways. So you can see how that'd be a huge advantage for the average Spanish soldier fighting the Aztecs. All right, now let's hit it with a good slash. Oh. That actually didn't work very well at all. I don't really know what happened. Maybe my edge alignment was bad, but it didn't slice through the bone and it didn't slice through the little chunk that was hanging off of it. All right, time to try again. Again, not very much. All right, this time we have a better shot at a lot of the meat and muscles, so let's see what happens. Oh. Well, the rapier really didn't cut as well as the Macuahuitl. It left this huge chunk there. It didn't cut all the way through. It seems like it hit kind of the bone and just stopped, whereas the Macuahuitl completely cut it off in one swipe and still had enough force to cut through my backdrop over there. You know, maybe that's just luck, who knows, but I'm honestly really surprised. Maybe the edges of obsidian really just are that deadly. One big advantage I'll say though is that we barely have any blades left in our Macuahuitl, whereas the rapier is pretty much untouched even though it hit bone. However, it seems like a lot of my blades actually flew out just because they weren't set in very well. They didn't even contact anything, they just flew out. So perhaps it has to do with my design. And this reminds me of a quote that the Spaniard said about the Macuahuitl. So while the rapier was obviously a better thrusting weapon, the Macuahuitl might have been a better slashing weapon.
Now I will read to you about the account of the horse being decapitated by the Macuahuitl. Bernal Diaz de Castillo said, "Pedro de Morón was a very good horseman, and as he charged with 3 other horsemen into the ranks of the enemy, the Indians seized hold of his lance and he was not able to drag it away, and others gave him cuts with their broadswords, and wounded him badly. And then they slashed at the mare, and cut her head off at the neck so that it hung by the skin, and she fell dead." This is one of the most famous accounts of the Macuahuitl, as it suggests this weapon could decapitate a horse. He does say broadsword, suggesting it was a large 2-handed Macuahuitl, which would make sense. Spike TV actually tried to test this out on a ballistics gel horse head. Unfortunately, they used a horrible Macuahuitl, but even this example was very effective at decapitating the replica horse. Let's look at one more Spanish account that marvels at the effectiveness of the Macuahuitl. They have swords of this kind, of wood made like a 2-handed sword. The edges are grooved, and in the grooves they insert stone knives that cut like a Toledo blade. I saw one day an Indian fighting with a mounted man, and the Indian gave the horse of his antagonist such a blow in the breast that he opened it to the entrails, that stretched it dead at his feet. For those unfamiliar, blades from Toledo, Spain were some of the best in the world. Since the times of the Romans, blades from Toledo have been revered for their superior quality. Even Japanese katana makers were blown away by Toledo steel, which was hard yet very flexible. Many conquistadors carried these blades into the New World, And the fact that this conquistador compared obsidian to Toledo blades was just too cool not to mention. But now, let's move on to the next test: decapitating a man.
Now it's finally time to try the two-handed Macuahuitl. We're going to be testing it out on this ballistics gel head. It's supposed to be 95% accurate to a real human head. First, I just want to see if we can slice it in half, and then next we're going to decapitate it. So this is going to be pretty cool. I am very scared to mess this up. Oh! Well, that was by all means a catastrophic failure. My Macuahuitl split completely in half at the edge right here. All of the blades went flying out, basically on both sides too. We barely have any blades over here. So yeah, that was a total failure. Here's the blade of my Macuahuitl. It still has a blade lodged between the wood right there. Pretty gnarly stuff. Only like 1.5 blades stayed in place. But if we look at the dummy, I mean, we did definitely kill him. You know, we cut right into his skull. That would have killed you. But this is definitely not how I wanted this to go. And I don't know if we're going to be able to decapitate him now because we only have one blade left in place. We still have some blades left, so let's try to decapitate him again. Oh. Well, that was epic. Even though our Macuahuitl, it totally exploded. Look at this, we cut right through his face, broke his jaw. Oh my gosh, you can see we cut right through his teeth into his face. But look at that. That would have been a dead Spaniard right there. We got obsidian lodged in his face. Well, we got plenty of use out of this Macuahuitl. Well, now it's time to test the only weapon we have left, the rapier. Oh! Well, the rapier is definitely deadly, but I think we already all knew that. So now let's try to cut his head in two, what the Macuahuitl could not do. Oh! Oh man, I'm covered in blue dye all over my nice coat. Dang.
Well, the testing was fun, but I'm definitely disappointed. I believe that the grooves I cut to put the blades into the wood were far too deep, which led my two-handed Macuahuitl to split easily. The wood was also far too thin, so I'm going to have to make some stronger replicas. But regardless of my tests, we know from Spanish accounts that many conquistadors were mortally wounded by these weapons. Imagine spending months at sea, then baking in the sun of Mexico just to get killed by a bunch of rocks glued to a stick. Jokes aside, the Spanish knew these weapons were deadly, and many of them wore armor to protect themselves. Full plate armor would have made a conquistador nearly invulnerable to Aztec weapons. Obsidian nor steel swords could cut through steel plate. But most conquistadors simply couldn't afford full plate. And even those who could often only wore partial plate due to the hot and humid climate of Mexico. This meant that often their limbs were left protected only by cotton padding or chainmail. But could the Macuahuitl cut through mail? I honestly have no idea, and that's why I bought this mail to test it out.
So this is riveted chainmail. It's pretty similar to what the Spanish would have been wearing, and let's just see how it holds up. Will our Spanish dummy survive the Macuahuitl? All right, we still get a lot of the blades, but I'm gonna need to hit this really hard. Oh. Well, I finally broke this Macuahuitl, but I think we did significant damage to this guy. Obviously, we didn't cut through the mail, but the rings are pretty bent. That would have been a fatal wound right there. The skull is completely fractured all over right here. So though it wasn't actually the obsidian doing the killing, it still would have been a deadly blow.
Mail would have been quite protective against obsidian, but of course limbs, the face, and certain extremities were vulnerable. The Spanish were not necessarily walking tanks, and we know this from an event the Spanish called the Night of Sorrows. On this night, as the Spanish tried to escape the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, over 400 soldiers of roughly 1,300 were lost in the retreat. Some estimates claim even more had perished, while Cortés himself was injured. Clearly the Spanish were not invincible, but how does the weapon compare to a Spanish rapier? Well, as mentioned earlier, the rapier was a more versatile weapon. It could thrust and slash. It was also more durable compared to the fragile blades of the Macuahuitl. The truth is that Aztec warriors knew that the edges of their weapons were fragile. Long before the Spanish ever showed up, they fought against opponents with their own Macuahuitl and also shields that could quickly dull their weapons. This is why they spent years training artful use of the Macuahuitl. They knew when and where to strike, preserving their weapon for a fatal blow. And some conquistadors did indeed die due to the obsidian teeth of the Macuahuitl. There is no doubt that the rapier or other Spanish weapons were technologically superior in almost every way, But this doesn't take anything away from the Macuahuitl. To me, it is far more interesting than any metal sword. It is also important to note that contrary to popular belief, the Spanish didn't conquer Mexico solely by their own technological advantages. During the siege of the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, it is estimated that there were 200,000 indigenous allies. These allies were primarily from groups like the Tlaxcala and the Sempoala, who resented the Aztec Empire and joined forces with the Spanish conquistadors. At one point, it is estimated that for every Spaniard, there were at least 10 native auxiliaries, and sometimes as many as 30. These auxiliaries were most often armed with Macuahuitl. So the idea that the Spanish conquered the Aztecs out of pure technological superiority is not accurate. In reality, it was mainly the Macuahuitl that conquered the Aztecs. They really were one of the most common weapons used in the region. Most often they were paired with a shield and used in one hand. Warriors wore thick cotton armor and often helmets, and large decorated banners extending from their back. The other most common weapons of the Aztecs would be the atlatl, a lever used to throw spears much further and faster. Many English speakers incorrectly pronounce this word as atlatl or atl-atl, but just like the name of the language Nahuatl, you do not pronounce the TL as you would in English. Instead of the L, you make a hard T sound and blow air out of both sides of your mouth. That's why saying atlatl is wrong. It's atlatl. And that's why it's correctly pronounced the Macuahuitl. From the Spanish codices, we can see a little bit of how the Aztec warriors may have fought in battle. They used their long-range atlatl to engage the Spanish, who often lacked ranged weapons in these images. Unfortunately, there are no depictions of a one-on-one duel, but I did find this image of a man being unhorsed and presumably killed. Imagine being an Aztec warrior and before you lie the weapons and armor of the Spanish. Just holding a metal sword or wearing a Spanish helmet must have been astonishing for a people that had never seen steel. I should, however, note that metal was widespread in Mesoamerica, including bronze and other strong copper alloys. The Aztecs even lost a battle to the Purépecha, which often used bronze axes and spears. They were not some primitive people with no understanding of metal, but steel was new to them and it was highly sought after. The indigenous allies that fought alongside the Spanish were technically not allowed to possess Spanish weapons, but high-ranking individuals were sometimes given Spanish swords for their practical use in battle as well as to foster loyalty. It must have been the ultimate flex to have a steel sword while all of your people had the traditional Macuahuitl. Next, let's talk a little bit about the history of the Aztecs, their religion, and how the Macuahuitl was used in battle. The Macuahuitl predates the Aztecs. Some attestations of a type of Macuahuitl were also present during the Olmec times. It was widespread throughout many Mesoamerican cultures such as the Mixtecs, Purépecha, and others. But we should start by explaining who the Aztecs actually were. The so-called Aztec Empire was built by a political and military pact formed in 1428 between the three city-states of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. Historians call this the Triple Alliance, and it became the foundation for a powerful regional empire that ruled much of central Mexico until the Spanish invasion in 1521. But the people at the heart of this alliance never called themselves the Aztecs. That name was invented centuries later, popularized in the 1800s by a German scholar drawing from the legendary homeland of Aztlan. In their own time, they called themselves the Mexica. They were a Nahua-speaking people who rose from migrants to empire builders. Other groups in the Valley of Mexico also used the term Mexica, but they were distinct from the political elite of Tenochtitlan. And it's important to remember that the Mexica were one civilization among many. Within the Triple Alliance, Tenochtitlan quickly became the dominant force, overshadowing its partners and often proving its military superiority during ritualized wars known as the Flower Wars. A flower war was a ritual war fought intermittently between the Aztec Triple Alliance and its enemies on and off for many years. In typical Aztec warfare, the main objectives were political, religious, and socio-economic. The Flower War was a secondary type of war that differed from typical warfare. The battle would occur on a pre-selected date, and their battle tactics differed. Normally, the Aztecs used projectiles and ranged weapons to weaken the enemy before entering close combat. But in the Flower Wars, they set aside ranged weapons and instead mainly used their Macuahuitl in close combat. This allowed warriors to display their individual combat ability, which was important for gaining status. Flower Wars were generally less lethal than typical wars, but a long-running Flower War could become increasingly deadly over time. The Flower Wars have a lot to do with the religion of the Mexica. They followed the order of their patron and god of war, Huitzilopochtli. The Flower Wars were a great way to appease the gods through combat and sacrifice. They believed that to balance life in the cosmos, they had to give blood to the earth. This was because the gods gave their own blood to the earth to create humans in the first place. And to do so, they needed people to sacrifice. The Flower Wars were often centered around the capture of enemy warriors. And the Macuahuitl was a perfect weapon to do so. In typical warfare, the Macuahuitl was primarily a killing weapon, make no doubt about it. But it could also be used to capture enemies. Some of the blades could be removed, creating a much less deadly edge. Instead of fully severing limbs, these edges would limit penetration and create a non-fatal wound. The flat side of the weapon could also be used to club enemies unconscious. The capturing of enemies greatly improved your status as a warrior. To advance into the elite warrior societies, you needed to capture at least 20 live warriors. But there's two myths about the Macuahuitl that I would like to address. The first one is that it was primarily just for capturing enemies and wasn't that deadly, and the second one is that the blades were meant to shatter, creating unhealable wounds. But neither of these are necessarily true. As we have seen through testing, the Macuahuitl was first and foremost a lethal cutting weapon capable of severing limbs and cutting men in two. This is supported by the codices, which show limbs strewn about the battlefield. The Macuahuitl certainly could leave obsidian in wounds and could be used for stunning live enemies, but these are also byproducts of its design. The Macuahuitl is one of the most fascinating weapons of all time. I am absolutely obsessed with the ones I created, and I wish you guys could hold one for yourself. And remember, if we get 100k likes, one of you will actually get one, so run up the likes. Mesoamerican history is extremely fascinating and criminally underexplored on YouTube. It is an entire lost world that I hope to cover in more detail. And it's just so crazy to me that many of the people I personally know had ancestors that wielded obsidian weapons only a few centuries ago. It really puts into perspective just how tied we are to the past. If you guys like this deep dive into Mesoamerican weaponry, perhaps you would like to see my video about the Atlot. To end this video off, instead of saying our normal arrivederci, let's end it in a Nahuatl saying, Matotatzin an mechmilpieli. This phrase means, may our Father take care of you, Father in reference to the sun god. Alright, see ya.